I am 70 years old now, and when I look at my trembling hands, I often wonder how they once held an entire world together, a world that slowly slipped through my fingers without making a sound, like sand carried away by the wind. My name no longer matters much, because the woman I used to be, the one with dreams, laughter, and hope, was left behind many years ago, somewhere between the kitchen walls and the quiet nights that grew heavier with each passing day. I was not always this lonely. Once, I was a wife who believed in forever, a woman who built her life around a man she trusted with her heart, her youth, and her entire existence. I remember the early days of my marriage as if they belonged to someone else, a different life painted in warm colors, filled with soft laughter and promises whispered under dim lights. He used to look at me as if I was enough, as if I was his whole world, and I believed him without question, without fear, without ever imagining that one day those same eyes would look past me as if I had become invisible. Time has a cruel way of changing everything while making it seem like nothing has changed at all. Years passed, and I devoted myself to being the perfect wife, waking up before dawn to prepare meals, keeping the house in order, waiting for him every evening with a hopeful heart that longed for just a little attention, a little warmth. I ignored the small changes at first, the way he stopped asking how my day was, the way his laughter no longer reached his eyes when he spoke to me, the growing silence between us that slowly replaced the comfort we once shared. I told myself this was normal, that marriages settle into quiet routines, that love does not always need words. But deep inside, there was a voice, soft yet persistent, whispering that something was slipping away from me, something I would never be able to hold again. As I grew older, I noticed how the world treated me differently, how people began to overlook me, how my reflection in the mirror started to carry the weight of time in every wrinkle, every gray strand of hair. I did not fear aging, not at first, because I believed I was not alone in this journey, that the man who once promised to stand by me would walk beside me through every stage of life. But I was wrong. I did not realize that while I was growing old with love and sacrifice, he was growing distant with silent dissatisfaction, seeking something I could no longer offer, something young, something new, something untouched by time. The day everything changed was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, painfully quiet. I remember it clearly, the way the sunlight entered the room as it always did, unaware that it was about to witness the breaking of a life. He sat across from me, his face unusually calm, almost indifferent, as if what he was about to say carried no weight at all. I sensed something was wrong, but I never imagined the words that followed would shatter me in a way I could never recover from. He told me he was leaving. Just like that. No hesitation, no remorse, no explanation that could make sense of the years we had spent together. He spoke of a younger woman, someone who made him feel alive again, someone who brought back the excitement he claimed had been missing for years. I did not cry at that moment. Perhaps my heart refused to accept the reality, or perhaps the shock was too deep for tears to find their way out. I simply sat there, staring at the man I once knew, trying to recognize even a fragment of the person I had loved so deeply. But he was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw me not as a partner, not as someone who had stood by him through every hardship, but as a burden he no longer wished to carry. He spoke as if I should understand, as if his happiness justified the destruction of mine. And in that moment, I realized something that broke me more than his words ever could. I realized that I had spent my entire life loving someone who had already begun to forget me long before he walked away. When he left, he did not take much with him, just a suitcase and whatever remained of his loyalty. But what he left behind was far heavier. He left behind silence that echoed through the empty rooms, memories that refused to fade, and a loneliness so profound that it felt like it had wrapped itself around my very soul. I walked through the house that once felt like a home, touching the walls, the furniture, the little things that held pieces of our life together, and I felt like a ghost wandering through a place that no longer belonged to me. Every corner carried a memory, every memory carried a pain, and every pain reminded me that I had been abandoned not just by a man, but by the life I had built with him. That night, I sat alone in the dark, listening to the silence that had replaced his presence, and for the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be alone. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being physically alone, but the kind that settles deep within your heart, where no one can reach you, where even your own thoughts begin to feel like strangers. I wanted to cry, to scream, to ask why, but the questions had no answers, and the tears refused to come. All I could do was sit there, holding on to the fragments of a life that had already fallen apart, wondering how I would find the strength to wake up the next morning and face a world that suddenly felt so unfamiliar. The morning after he left did not feel like a new beginning. It felt like a continuation of a nightmare that refused to end, a quiet extension of the pain that had settled into every corner of my being, making even the simplest act of opening my eyes feel like an unbearable burden. I woke up out of habit, not purpose, my body still conditioned by decades of routine, expecting to hear the faint sounds that once filled the house, the rustle of his movements, the familiar cough, the distant clink of a cup placed on the table. But there was nothing, only a stillness so heavy that it pressed against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. For a few brief seconds, I allowed myself the illusion that nothing had changed, that he was still there, that the previous day had been some cruel dream my mind had created. But reality has a way of reminding you of its presence in the harshest possible ways. And as I turned my head to the empty side of the bed, the truth returned, sharp and unforgiving. I sat up slowly, my joints aching not just from age but from a sorrow that seemed to have seeped into my bones overnight, and I looked around the room that had once been ours, noticing how everything remained exactly as it was, untouched and indifferent to the storm that had passed through my life. His clothes were still hanging in the wardrobe, his shoes neatly placed by the door, his scent faintly lingering in the air. And for a moment, it felt as though he might walk back in at any second, as though this absence was temporary, as though I had not been abandoned but merely left alone for a while. But deep inside, I knew better, and that knowledge settled into my heart like a quiet, unshakable truth that no amount of hope could erase. I forced myself to get out of bed, my feet touching the cold floor, sending a chill through my body that seemed to mirror the emptiness inside me, and I walked slowly toward the kitchen, following a path I had taken countless times before, a path that now felt unfamiliar and distant, as if it belonged to someone else's life. I reached for the kettle, filled it with water, and placed it on the stove, my hands moving automatically, guided by memory rather than intention. And as I waited for the water to boil, I found myself staring at nothing, my mind lost in a haze of thoughts that refused to form into anything coherent. I poured the tea into a cup and sat at the table, placing another cup across from me without thinking, a silent gesture of a habit that had not yet learned to accept the absence of its purpose. And when I realized what I had done, a quiet ache spread through my chest, not sharp enough to make me cry, but deep enough to remind me that I was no longer living the life I once knew. Hours passed without meaning, time stretching and folding in ways that made it impossible to measure, and I moved through the house like a shadow, touching objects, rearranging things that did not need to be rearranged. As if by changing the position of a chair or a photograph, I could somehow restore a sense of order to the chaos within me. I picked up an old picture from the shelf, one taken many years ago, when we were both younger, standing side by side with smiles that seemed genuine and full of life. And I studied his face, searching for any sign of the man who had once loved me, any indication that what we had shared was real and not just something I had imagined. But the more I looked, the more distant it felt, as though the people in that photograph were strangers whose lives had nothing to do with mine, whose happiness had no connection to the pain I now carried. As the day wore on, the silence became louder, filling the spaces between my thoughts, making it impossible to escape the reality of my situation. And I found myself sitting by the window, watching the world continue as if nothing had changed, people passing by, cars moving along the road, life unfolding in its usual rhythm, indifferent to the fact that mine had come to a standstill. I wondered how it was possible for everything to remain the same while I felt so completely altered, as though I had been removed from the flow of time and placed in a space where nothing could move forward, where every moment was trapped in a loop of memory and loss. In the quiet of that afternoon, I began to think about the years I had spent with him, not just the happy moments, but everything in between, the sacrifices, the compromises, the small pieces of myself I had given away without ever asking for anything in return, believing that love was about giving without limits, about putting someone else's needs before your own, about building a life together even if it meant losing parts of yourself along the way. I had believed in that kind of love so deeply that I never stopped to consider what would happen if it was not returned in the same way. If one day the person I had built my world around decided that my presence was no longer enough, that my existence had become something he could simply walk away from without looking back. As evening approached, the light began to fade, casting long shadows across the walls, and I felt a growing sense of unease, a quiet fear of the night that was about to come, because I knew that with darkness would come a deeper awareness of my loneliness, a heavier silence that would press against me from all sides. I turned on the lights, trying to push back the encroaching gloom, but the brightness only made the emptiness more visible, highlighting the absence rather than concealing it, and I found myself wishing for something I could not quite name, something that could fill the void, even if only for a moment. I prepared a simple meal, though I had little appetite, placing the food on the table and sitting down as I always had. But this time, there was no conversation, no shared presence, only the sound of my own movements, the quiet clink of utensils against the plate, the faint echo of a life that no longer existed. I took a few bites, more out of necessity than desire, and then pushed the plate away, unable to continue, feeling as though even the act of eating had lost its meaning in a world that had suddenly become so empty. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt the weight of everything settle upon me. The realization that this was not a temporary pain, not something that would fade with time, but a new reality I would have to learn to live with, a loneliness that would accompany me through the remaining years of my life. I thought about him, about where he might be, about the woman he had chosen over me, about the life he was beginning while mine seemed to be ending. And for the first time, a single tear escaped, sliding down my temple and disappearing into the pillow, a quiet acknowledgement of a heartbreak too deep for words. As sleep slowly claimed me, I held onto one fragile thought, not of hope, but of survival, a silent promise to myself that somehow, in some way, I would find a way to continue, even if I did not yet know how, even if the path ahead was unclear and filled with shadows, because despite everything that had been taken from me, I was still here, still breathing, still existing in a world that no longer felt like home. And perhaps, in that existence, there was still something left to discover. Something that had not yet been lost. The days that followed did not come with any clear shape or meaning. They simply drifted into one another like indistinguishable shadows, each carrying the same quiet ache, the same hollow silence that had settled into my life as if it had always belonged there. And I began to lose track of time in a way I never had before, as though the clock on the wall was still moving, but my life had somehow stopped beneath it. I would wake up without purpose, sit for hours without thought, and move through the house without direction, touching things not because I needed to, but because I was trying to remind myself that I still existed, that I had not completely disappeared along with the life that had been taken from me. There were moments when I would forget, just for a second, that he was gone, moments when I would hear a faint sound and turn my head instinctively, expecting to see him walking through the door or calling my name from another room. And in those brief, fragile seconds, my heart would lift slightly, only to fall again with a deeper, more painful weight when reality returned and reminded me that I was alone, truly alone, in a way I had never experienced before. I began to notice how the smallest things carried the heaviest memories, how a simple object could hold years of laughter, arguments, shared silence, and unspoken understanding, and how those memories now felt like quiet echoes of a life that no longer belonged to me. The chair where he used to sit remained untouched, as though I feared that moving it would erase the last trace of his presence, the last evidence that he had once been a part of this home. And sometimes I would find myself standing in front of it, staring at the empty space, imagining him there, imagining the sound of his voice, the way he would look at me, even in those later years when his gaze had begun to lose its warmth, and I would wonder when exactly everything had started to change. When the love we once shared had begun to fade into something distant and unrecognizable. I thought back to the small moments I had ignored, the subtle shifts in his behavior, the times he had come home later than usual, the way he had begun to avoid conversations, the way his eyes would drift away from mine as if they were searching for something beyond me. And I realized with a quiet, painful clarity that perhaps I had seen it all along, but had chosen not to acknowledge it, because accepting it would have meant facing a truth I was not ready to confront. A truth that now stood before me with undeniable certainty. There was a heaviness in my chest that did not leave, a constant presence that made even breathing feel like an effort, and I found myself sitting by the window more often, watching the outside world as if it were something separate from me, something I could observe but no longer be a part of, and I would see people walking together, laughing, talking, sharing moments that seemed so simple and ordinary, and I would feel a quiet ache of longing, not just for him, but for the version of myself that had once belonged to that kind of life. I began to question everything, not just our marriage, but my own choices, my own identity, wondering if I had lost myself somewhere along the way, if I had given so much of who I was to him that, when he left, there was nothing substantial left behind, only fragments of a person who no longer knew how to exist on her own. Nights became the most difficult, stretching endlessly with thoughts that refused to quiet down, memories replaying themselves in ways that felt both vivid and distant, and I would lie awake, staring into the darkness, feeling as though I was surrounded by ghosts of a past that would not let me rest. There were times when I would speak out loud, not expecting an answer, but needing to hear a voice in the silence, even if it was my own, and in those moments, I would realize just how deep my loneliness had become, how it had settled into a place within me that no one else could reach. I began to notice changes in myself, small at first, but undeniable, a growing sense of detachment from everything around me, a feeling that I was no longer fully present in my own life, as though I was watching it from a distance, unable to step back into it. I stopped caring about things that once mattered to me, stopped paying attention to details, to routines, to the little habits that had once given structure to my days, and everything began to blur into a quiet, colorless existence that felt both heavy and empty at the same time. And yet, somewhere beneath all of that, there was still a faint awareness, a small, persistent part of me that refused to completely disappear, that held on to the idea that this could not be the end, that there had to be something beyond this pain, even if I could not yet see it or understand it. It was not hope, not in the way I had once known it, but something quieter, something more fragile, like a distant light barely visible through thick fog, a reminder that I was still here, still breathing, still capable of feeling, even if those feelings were filled with sorrow and loss. And so I continued, not because I knew where I was going or what I would find, but simply because stopping was not an option, because even in the depths of my loneliness, there was still a part of me that wanted to move forward, even if every step felt uncertain, even if the path ahead was unclear, because perhaps somewhere, beyond the silence and the emptiness, there was still something waiting for me, something that had not yet been taken away. As the weeks slowly passed, I began to understand that pain does not always come in loud waves that break you all at once. Sometimes it seeps quietly into your days, settling into your routine until it becomes a part of how you breathe, how you think, how you exist, and I found myself adjusting to a life I had never chosen, a life that felt unfamiliar yet unavoidable, as though I had been placed into it without my consent and now had no choice but to learn its patterns. The house no longer felt like a shared space filled with memories of togetherness. It had become something else entirely, something heavier, something that reflected my solitude in ways I could not ignore, and yet I could not bring myself to leave it, because despite everything, it still held the fragments of a life that had once given me meaning. I started opening windows more often, letting fresh air move through the rooms as if I was trying to push out the stillness that had taken over. But no matter how much light I allowed in, the emptiness remained, unchanged and persistent, like a shadow that refused to fade. There were moments when I would stand in front of the mirror and study my reflection for a long time, noticing every line on my face, every sign of age that I had once accepted with quiet dignity. But now those same signs seemed to carry a different weight, as if they were the very reasons I had been left behind, and I would wonder if things might have been different had I been younger. Had my hair still carried its natural color? Had my face still held the softness of youth? But those thoughts only led me deeper into a place of quiet self-doubt, a place where I began to question my worth in ways I never had before. I remembered how he used to look at me in the early years, how there had once been admiration in his eyes, a kind of gentle affection that made me feel seen and valued. And I tried to recall when exactly that look had changed, when it had been replaced by something distant, something indifferent, something that made me feel as though I was no longer enough. I replayed countless moments in my mind, searching for answers that never came, wondering if I had failed in ways I did not recognize, if there was something I could have done differently to keep him from leaving. But deep down I knew that some things cannot be controlled, that love cannot be forced to remain where it no longer wishes to stay, and yet accepting that truth did not make it any less painful. I began to step outside more often, not because I wanted to, but because staying inside the house for too long made the silence unbearable. And as I walked slowly along the familiar streets, I noticed how everything seemed both the same and different at the same time. The shops were still open. People still moved with purpose. Conversations still filled the air, but I felt separate from it all, as though I was observing life from a distance rather than living it. There were times when I would catch people looking at me, not with judgment, but with a kind of passing curiosity, and I would wonder what they saw. An old woman walking alone, moving slowly, carrying a life they knew nothing about, and I realized how invisible a person can become, how easily their story can remain hidden beneath the surface of ordinary appearances. One afternoon, as I sat on a bench watching children play nearby, I felt something shift within me, not a sudden change, but a subtle awareness, a quiet realization that despite everything I had lost, the world had not stopped. Life continued in ways both simple and profound, and for a brief moment I felt a strange sense of calm, not happiness, but a pause in the constant ache, a moment where the weight felt slightly lighter. It did not last long, but it was enough to remind me that my pain, while deep and consuming, was not the only thing that existed, that there were still moments, however small, where I could breathe without feeling completely overwhelmed. When I returned home that evening, the house greeted me with the same silence, the same stillness, but something inside me had shifted, even if only slightly, and I found myself moving through the rooms with a little more awareness, a little more intention, as if I was beginning to reclaim small pieces of the space for myself, rather than seeing it only as a place filled with absence. I cooked a simple meal again, sat at the table, and this time I did not place a second cup across from me, not because I had forgotten, but because I had remembered that he was no longer there. And in that small act, there was a quiet acceptance, a step so small it could easily be overlooked, but for me, it carried a meaning I could not ignore. That night, as I lay in bed, I did not feel the same overwhelming heaviness that had filled the previous nights. The loneliness was still there, the emptiness still present, but there was also a faint sense of something else, something I could not fully name, perhaps the beginning of understanding, perhaps the first fragile step toward learning how to exist in a life that had been broken and reshaped in ways I had never imagined. And as sleep slowly came to me, I held on to that feeling. However small it was, because in a world where so much had been taken from me, even the smallest shift felt like something worth holding on to. The days continued to pass with a quiet steadiness, no longer as heavy as those first unbearable moments, yet still carrying an undercurrent of sorrow that refused to completely leave me. And I began to notice how my heart was slowly learning to endure rather than collapse, as though it had accepted that this pain was not temporary, but something it would have to live beside. I found myself waking earlier than before, not because I had something to look forward to, but because sleep had become lighter, filled with fragments of memories that surfaced and disappeared before I could hold on to them. And as I sat on the edge of my bed each morning, I would take a deep breath, steadying myself for another day that felt both empty and quietly demanding. There was a strange sense of awareness growing inside me, a recognition of my own presence in a way I had not felt for many years, as if in losing him, I had been forced to confront the parts of myself I had long ignored, the parts that had been buried beneath years of routine, responsibility, and silent sacrifice. I began to move through the house with a different kind of attention, noticing things I had never paid much mind to before, The way sunlight entered through the windows at different times of the day, the faint sounds of the outside world filtering in, the subtle changes in the air as morning turned into evening, and these small observations, though simple, began to create a quiet rhythm in my life, a rhythm that belonged only to me. There were moments when memories would return unexpectedly, not always painful, sometimes soft and distant, like echoes of a life that had once been real. And instead of pushing them away, I started allowing them to pass through me, understanding that they were a part of who I had been, not something I needed to erase in order to move forward. I realized that my love for him, despite everything, had been genuine, and that truth, though painful, also carried a kind of quiet strength, because it meant that I had lived with an open heart, that I had given deeply, even if it had not been returned in the way I had hoped. As I spent more time alone, I began to reflect on the years of my life not just as a wife, but as a person, and I started to see how much of myself had been shaped by my role in the marriage, how many of my choices had been influenced by his needs, his preferences, his presence, and I wondered what my life might have looked like if I had allowed myself to exist more fully as an individual rather than always as part of a pair. This realization did not come with regret as much as it came with a quiet curiosity, a sense that perhaps there was still time, even now, to discover who I was beyond the identity I had carried for so long. One afternoon, I found myself opening a drawer I had not touched in years, filled with old letters, small keepsakes, and pieces of a past that felt both familiar and distant. And as I went through them slowly, I began to reconnect with memories that belonged solely to me, moments from before my marriage, dreams I had once held, thoughts I had once written down, and it felt like meeting a younger version of myself, a version that had not yet been shaped by years of compromise and quiet endurance. There was something both comforting and unsettling in that experience. Comforting because it reminded me that I had once been more than what I had become, and unsettling because it made me realize how much of that version had been set aside over time. As the days turned into weeks, I started to step outside my home with a little more intention, not just to escape the silence, but to experience something beyond it. And though the world still felt distant, there were moments when I felt a slight connection, a brief awareness that I was still part of it, even if my place within it had changed. I would walk slowly, observing people, listening to the sounds around me, allowing myself to exist in those moments without thinking too much about the past or the future. And in those small stretches of time, I found a kind of quiet relief, a pause in the constant cycle of memory and loss. Evenings remained difficult, as they often brought a deeper awareness of my solitude, but I began to create small routines to carry me through them. Simple acts like making tea, sitting by the window, or listening to the faint sounds of life outside. And though these routines did not erase the loneliness, they gave me something to hold on to, something that provided a sense of structure in a life that had once felt completely unanchored. I no longer expected the pain to disappear, but I was beginning to understand that it could exist alongside other feelings, that it did not have to consume every part of me. And this understanding, though fragile, gave me a quiet sense of strength, a feeling that perhaps I was not as broken as I had once believed. And so I continued, one day at a time, not with certainty or clarity, but with a growing awareness that even in the aftermath of loss, even in the presence of deep and lasting sorrow, there was still a path forward, however unclear it might be. And that perhaps, in time, I would learn not just how to survive this life, but how to live within it again, in a way that belonged entirely to me. As more time slipped quietly past me, I began to notice that my memories were no longer as sharp as they had once been. They no longer cut through me with the same sudden force, but instead settled into a softer, lingering ache that stayed with me throughout the day like a shadow that had learned to walk beside me rather than chase me. And in that subtle change, I felt something within me shifting, something that did not erase the pain but made it easier to carry. I no longer woke up with the same sense of shock, that immediate realization that he was gone, because that truth had slowly become a part of my reality, woven into my understanding of each new day. And though it still hurt, it no longer felt unreal. It no longer felt like something that might suddenly reverse itself if I waited long enough. I began to speak to myself more often, not out of loneliness alone, but as a way to hear my own thoughts, to understand the quiet voice inside me that had been unheard for so many years. And in those moments, I started to feel a strange sense of companionship within myself, as though I was slowly becoming familiar with a presence I had long ignored. There were afternoons when I would sit with a cup of tea in my hands, watching the steam rise and disappear into the air, and I would find myself thinking not about him, but about life in a broader sense, about how unpredictable it is, how it takes and gives without warning, how it reshapes us in ways we never expect. And instead of feeling anger or bitterness, I felt a quiet acceptance beginning to form, not because I believed what had happened was right, but because I understood that holding on to resentment would only keep me tied to a past that could not be changed. I started to take better care of myself in small, almost unnoticed ways, preparing meals that were not just simple necessities, but something I chose with intention, opening my wardrobe and selecting clothes not out of routine, but out of a quiet desire to feel presentable for myself, even if no one else was there to see me. And these small acts, though seemingly insignificant, began to create a sense of dignity within me, a reminder that I still mattered, even in my solitude. There were still moments when memories would return with unexpected clarity, moments when I would hear a song, smell something familiar, or come across an object that would instantly take me back to a time when my life felt whole. And in those moments, I would pause, allowing myself to feel the emotion without resisting it, understanding that those memories were not enemies to be fought, but parts of my story that I could carry without letting them define me completely. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the sky slowly darken, I realized that I had gone an entire day without thinking of him constantly. His presence had not dominated every moment of my thoughts, and though this realization brought a brief sense of relief, it was quickly followed by something else, something more complex, a quiet sadness at the idea that he was slowly becoming a memory rather than a central part of my life, and I found myself wondering if forgetting, even partially, was another kind of loss, a second goodbye that came not with words but with time. I began to understand that healing does not come as a single moment of change. It comes gradually, in layers, in small shifts that are almost invisible until you look back and realize how far you have come. And though I was not free from my pain, I was no longer entirely consumed by it. I started to notice things around me with a renewed sense of awareness, the way the light changed throughout the day, the quiet sounds of the evening, the rhythm of life continuing outside my window. And these observations, though simple, gave me a sense of connection, a feeling that I was still part of the world, even if my role within it had changed. There were times when I would sit in silence and feel something close to peace, not a complete absence of pain, but a gentle stillness that allowed me to rest without the constant weight of sorrow pressing down on me. And in those moments, I felt a quiet gratitude, not for what had happened, but for my ability to endure it, to remain present despite everything that had been taken from me. As I lay in bed each night, I no longer feared the darkness in the same way, because I had come to understand that it was not the night itself that had frightened me, but the thoughts it carried. And as those thoughts began to soften, the nights became less overwhelming, more bearable, and sometimes even calm. I did not know what the future held for me. I did not have plans or expectations, but for the first time since he left, I felt a small sense of stability, a quiet grounding within myself that did not depend on anyone else. And though it was fragile, it was real, and it was mine. And so I continued forward, not with urgency, not with certainty, but with a growing understanding that life, even when broken, can still be lived, that even in the absence of what once defined us, there is still a way to exist with meaning, even if that meaning is something we have to discover slowly, piece by piece, in the quiet moments we learn to call our own. As the months quietly unfolded around me, I began to feel a change that was difficult to describe, not something sudden or dramatic, but something deeper and steadier, like a slow awakening of a part of me that had been asleep for far too long. And I realized that while I had spent years living for someone else, shaping my days around his presence and his needs, I was now standing in a space where I had to learn how to exist for myself. A task that felt unfamiliar but not entirely impossible. There were mornings when I would sit by the window with my tea, watching the world move with its usual rhythm, and instead of feeling completely separate from it, I began to feel a faint sense of belonging again, not in the way I once had, but in a quieter, more personal way, as though I was rediscovering my place in a world that had not stopped just because my life had changed. I started to remember things I used to enjoy before my life became centered entirely around my marriage. Small interests and simple pleasures that I had set aside without even realizing it. And though it felt strange at first, I allowed myself to revisit them, not with expectation, but with curiosity, as if I was gently reintroducing myself to a version of me that had been forgotten over time. There were moments when I would still think of him, not with the same sharp pain, but with a distant awareness, like remembering a place I once lived in but no longer belonged to. And I noticed that my thoughts were no longer filled with questions of why or how, but with a quiet acceptance that some answers are never meant to be found. I began to understand that his leaving, while deeply painful, had also forced me into a kind of awakening I might never have experienced otherwise. An awakening that was slowly guiding me toward a deeper understanding of myself, of my own strength, and of the quiet resilience that had carried me through even when I believed I could not go on. One afternoon, as I walked slowly through a nearby park, I paused to watch a group of children laughing and running freely, their voices filled with joy that seemed untouched by the complexities of life, and I felt a gentle warmth spread through me, not because I longed for the past, but because I could still recognize beauty in the present, still feel something other than sorrow. And in that moment, I realized that my ability to feel had not been lost. It had simply been buried beneath layers of pain that were now beginning to lift. I started to speak more kindly to myself, to replace the quiet doubts and questions with a softer understanding, acknowledging that I had done the best I could with the life I had lived, that my love had been real and my efforts sincere, and that his decision to leave did not erase my worth or define my value. This realization did not come easily. It was something I had to remind myself of again and again, but with time, it began to settle into me as a truth I could hold onto. Evenings became less intimidating, no longer filled with the same overwhelming sense of emptiness, and though the house was still quiet, it no longer felt as suffocating as it once had, because I was beginning to fill that silence with my own presence, my own thoughts, my own quiet existence that no longer depended on someone else to feel complete. There were still moments of sadness, moments when memories would surface unexpectedly and bring with them a familiar ache, but those moments no longer lasted as long. They passed through me more gently, like waves that rise and fall without completely pulling me under. I began to see my life not as something that had ended, but as something that had changed, something that was still unfolding in ways I could not fully predict. And though the future remained uncertain, it no longer felt entirely empty. There was a quiet sense of possibility beginning to form, not the kind that comes with grand dreams or expectations, but a softer, more grounded possibility. The understanding that even in this stage of my life, there were still experiences to be had, still moments to be lived, still parts of myself to discover. And as I lay in bed each night, I no longer felt only the weight of what I had lost, but also a growing awareness of what remained, my strength, my resilience, my ability to endure and slowly rebuild. And in that awareness, I found a quiet comfort, a sense that perhaps I was not as alone as I had once believed, because I still had myself. And for the first time in a very long time, that felt like something worth holding on to. As time continued its quiet, steady movement, I began to notice that my days were no longer defined by what I had lost, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, by what I was beginning to rebuild within myself. And though the change was gentle and often difficult to recognize in the moment, it became clearer when I looked back and saw how far I had come from those early days of silence and emptiness. I started to create small intentions for each day, not grand plans or expectations, but simple things that gave my time a sense of direction, a reason to move forward even if only by a few steps, and in doing so, I felt a quiet sense of purpose returning to my life, not the same purpose I once had, but something new, something that belonged only to me. There were mornings when I would sit with my thoughts and feel a calmness that had once seemed impossible, a stillness that was not heavy or suffocating, but gentle and grounding, as though I had finally made space within myself for both my pain and my peace to exist together without conflict. I began to understand that healing was not about forgetting or replacing what had been lost, but about learning how to carry it in a way that did not break me, about allowing it to become a part of my story without letting it control every chapter that followed. I found myself more present in the small moments, noticing the way the light shifted throughout the day, the quiet rhythm of my own breathing, the subtle comfort of familiar routines, and these moments, though simple, began to hold a deeper meaning, reminding me that life was still unfolding around me, even if it looked different than it once had. There were times when I would think of him, not with longing or anger, but with a kind of distant acceptance, as though he had become a chapter in my life that had already been written and closed. And while the memories still existed, they no longer carried the same weight they once did. They had softened into something quieter, something that I could acknowledge without being overwhelmed. I began to feel a sense of independence that I had not experienced in many years, a realization that I was capable of living on my own, of making decisions for myself, of creating a life that was not shaped by someone else's presence or absence. And though this independence came from a place of loss, it also carried a quiet strength, a reminder that I was more resilient than I had ever believed. One afternoon, as I was sitting outside watching the sky, I felt something unexpected, a brief moment of contentment, not happiness in the way I once knew it, but a simple, peaceful acceptance of where I was. And that moment stayed with me, not because it was extraordinary, but because it showed me that my life was not defined solely by sorrow, that there were still spaces where I could exist without pain taking over. I started to take more care in how I spoke to myself, replacing the quiet self-doubt with a gentler understanding, reminding myself that my worth had never been dependent on someone else's choices, that I had always been enough, even if I had not always believed it. Evenings became a time of reflection rather than fear, a time where I could sit with my thoughts without feeling overwhelmed by them. And though the house remained quiet, it no longer felt empty in the same way, because I had begun to fill it with my own presence, my own energy, my own quiet sense of being. There were still moments of sadness, still days when the weight returned unexpectedly, but those moments no longer defined my entire existence. They became part of a larger experience, something that moved through me rather than something that held me in place. I began to see that my life, though changed, was not over, that there was still time, still space, still possibility, even if it looked different than anything I had imagined before. And as I moved forward, slowly and without urgency, I carried with me a growing sense of acceptance, a quiet understanding that while I could not change the past, I could still shape the present, that even in the later years of my life, there was still something left to discover, something that had not yet been taken from me. And in that realization, I found a gentle, steady strength that continued to guide me forward. As the seasons began to change, I noticed how the world around me continued its quiet transformations, trees shedding their leaves, the air shifting from warm to cool, the sky carrying different shades each day. And in these changes, I found a reflection of something within myself, a slow and steady transition that I could not fully explain but could deeply feel, as though I too was moving through a season of letting go and becoming something new. I no longer measured my days by what was missing, but by what I was beginning to understand, and that understanding came not in sudden realizations, but in small, quiet moments that settled gently into my heart. There were mornings when I would wake and feel a sense of calm that surprised me, a lightness that did not erase the past, but allowed me to carry it without the same heaviness. And I began to see that healing was not about returning to who I once was, but about growing into someone I had never had the chance to become. I started to notice how my thoughts had changed, how they no longer circled endlessly around the same questions of why and how, but instead moved more freely, exploring ideas of what could still be, what my life could look like in this new chapter, even if it was simple and quiet. I spent more time outside, allowing myself to sit in the presence of nature, to listen to the sounds of birds, to feel the breeze against my skin. And in those moments, I felt a connection that went beyond my personal loss, a reminder that life exists in many forms, that it continues regardless of individual pain, and that perhaps I was still a part of that larger, ongoing story. There were times when I would encounter people during my walks, brief exchanges of greetings or smiles, small interactions that carried no deep meaning but still reminded me that I was not completely invisible, that I still existed in the eyes of others, even if only for a moment, and those moments, though fleeting, brought a quiet sense of reassurance. I began to take pride in the small ways I was caring for myself, in the routines I had built, in the effort I made each day to keep moving forward, and I realized that strength does not always appear in grand gestures. Sometimes it exists in the simple act of continuing, of choosing to live even when life has been altered in ways you never expected. There were still memories that surfaced, still moments when I would think of him and feel a faint echo of what once was, but those memories no longer held me captive. They became part of a larger understanding, a recognition that my life had contained both love and loss, and that both were real, both were valid, both had shaped who I had become. One evening, as I sat quietly in my home, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time, a sense of comfort in my own presence, not loneliness, not emptiness, but a quiet companionship with myself. And in that moment, I realized that I had begun to rebuild a relationship with the one person who would remain with me through everything, myself. This realization did not come with celebration or excitement, but with a deep, steady peace, a feeling that I was no longer searching for something outside of me to feel whole, that perhaps I had always carried that wholeness within me, even when I could not see it. I began to understand that my story did not end when he left. It simply changed direction, moving into a path I had not chosen, but was now learning to walk with quiet strength and acceptance. Nights became moments of reflection rather than sorrow, times when I could sit with my thoughts and feel a sense of gratitude for my ability to endure, to adapt, to slowly heal in ways that felt natural and unforced. I no longer feared the future in the same way, though it remained uncertain. It no longer felt empty, because I had begun to fill my present with meaning, with awareness, with a quiet sense of purpose that did not depend on anything outside of me. And as I looked at my life with a new perspective, I saw not just the pain of what had been lost, but the strength of what remained, the resilience that had carried me through, the quiet courage that allowed me to keep going. And in that understanding, I found something unexpected, not happiness in the way I once knew it, but a deep, steady sense of peace that told me I would be all right, that even in the later years of my life, there was still a way forward, still a story left to live, still a self that was continuing to grow, one quiet day at a time. Life had begun to take on a different texture, a rhythm that was quieter, slower, yet filled with a depth I had not recognized before, and I found myself noticing details that had once escaped me, the subtle play of sunlight across the floor, the distant laughter of children in the street, the gentle hum of life continuing outside my walls. And in these simple observations, I began to feel a quiet connection to the world once more. I no longer measured my days by the absence of someone else, but by my own ability to inhabit them, to breathe into each moment with awareness rather than resistance. And though sorrow was still a companion, it had shifted from a weight that crushed me to a presence that simply existed alongside me, something I could acknowledge without letting it dominate my being. There were mornings when I would sit at the window for long stretches, watching the sky lighten with the rising sun, allowing my thoughts to wander freely, exploring memories, possibilities, and quiet reflections. And I noticed how these moments of stillness were slowly teaching me patience, a patience not just with life, but with myself, with my own healing, with the unfolding of a life I had never expected to live alone. I began to explore small joys, simple activities that had once been mundane or taken for granted. And in doing so, I discovered a sense of agency I had not realized I possessed, a quiet empowerment in making choices solely for myself, whether it was preparing a meal I enjoyed, tending to the few plants I had brought into my home, or choosing to take a walk along familiar streets simply because I wanted to. The memories of him did not vanish, but they no longer carried the sharp edge of despair. Instead, they became gentle reminders of a life shared, of lessons learned, of love that had existed and shaped me. And in allowing those memories to exist without fear or regret, I felt a freedom I had not known in years. I began to see that my identity was not solely tied to the years of marriage, nor to the role I had played in another person's life, but to the person I was rediscovering in solitude, someone who had endured, who had adapted, who could still experience beauty, wonder, and quiet contentment. Evenings became times of reflection, not dread, moments where I could sit with a cup of tea, a book, or simply my own thoughts, and feel a presence within me that was steady, reassuring, a witness to my own resilience and strength. I found comfort in routine, in the small consistencies that gave shape to my days, and through those routines, I discovered that stability could exist even in the absence of companionship, that life could be lived meaningfully even when it looked different from what I had envisioned. There were times when I would catch myself smiling at something small, an unexpected kindness from a neighbor, a bird landing nearby, the softness of a fading sunset, and in those moments, I realized that joy had not been lost, only buried beneath years of sorrow and adjustment, and that it was possible to reclaim it piece by piece. I began to embrace silence not as a void, but as a space for reflection, for growth, for listening to the quiet whispers of my own heart. And in that silence, I discovered an inner voice that was patient, wise, and nurturing, a voice I had rarely heard when my life had been so focused on the needs and desires of another. Nights no longer brought fear of emptiness, but an opportunity to rest within my own presence, to acknowledge the life I had lived, the losses I had endured, and the strength I had gained. And in those moments, I began to understand that survival was no longer enough, that perhaps now I could learn to truly live, even if in a different way than before. And as I drifted to sleep each night, I carried with me a quiet sense of continuity, a knowledge that though the past was etched into the very fabric of my being, it did not dictate the shape of my days, that even in my 70s, there was space for growth, for reflection, for peace, and that the chapters still ahead, though uncertain, were mine to live, slowly, steadily, and with gentle awareness of the life that remained within me. The days had taken on a new cadence, one shaped not by the presence or absence of another, but by the rhythm of my own thoughts, my own breathing, my own quiet movements, and I began to notice a clarity in those rhythms that had been absent in the chaos of heartbreak and grief, a clarity that revealed a subtle truth. That life, even when stripped of its familiar anchors, still offered moments of meaning if one was willing to notice them. I started to find pleasure in the simplest of acts, a cup of warm tea in the morning, the way sunlight touched the floor through the window, the gentle rustling of leaves outside. And in these small details, I began to sense a continuity of life, a reminder that the world moved on, carrying with it the possibility of quiet joy and a sense of belonging that was not dependent on anyone else. My mind no longer circled endlessly around questions of why he had left or how things might have been different. Instead, it began to wander gently, exploring ideas, memories, and reflections that felt lighter, less oppressive, less tied to the ache of loss. And I realized that a part of me was learning to breathe in this new space I had been thrust into, a space that was mine alone. Evenings became times of quiet meditation rather than dread, moments where I could sit with a book, a journal, or simply my own thoughts, allowing the day to settle around me without the pressure of expectation. And in that quietude, I found a sense of steadiness that I had not known for years, a grounding that reminded me I was still here, still capable of experiencing life. I began to notice my body in ways I had ignored for decades, the strength that remained, the subtle aches that marked a life well lived, the gentle reminders that I was still capable of movement, and that even as age advanced, there was vitality that could be nurtured, preserved, and appreciated in its own way. There were still moments when memories of him would surface, carrying with them a soft ache, a whisper of what had been, but these moments no longer dictated the contours of my day. They became gentle ripples in a larger pond of consciousness, passing through me without overwhelming, reminding me that love and loss coexist, that the past shapes but does not imprison, and that I had the capacity to hold both with grace. I started to speak to myself with care, using words of encouragement where doubt had once taken root, reminding myself that my life had value, that my presence mattered, and that the years behind me, though filled with sorrow and challenge, had also cultivated resilience, wisdom, and a deep understanding of what it meant to endure. Walks outside became more frequent, not as an escape, but as a way to feel connected to the living world, to witness the ongoing flow of life in all its variety, and in observing people, nature, and the gentle unfolding of each day. I found a sense of participation in something larger than my own grief, a reassurance that I was still part of a shared existence. Small routines became pillars of my day, quiet anchors that provided stability and comfort. And in tending to them, I discovered that self-care, even in modest forms, could carry profound significance, teaching me that nurturing myself was not indulgent, but necessary for survival and growth. Nights no longer arrived with a sense of foreboding. Instead, they offered a chance to reflect, to rest, to acknowledge the endurance that had carried me to this point, and to imagine, however faintly, what could still unfold in the time I had remaining, not with expectation, but with gentle curiosity. I realized that my story was far from over, that while one chapter had closed in heartbreak, another had begun in quiet resilience, and that each day presented an opportunity to continue discovering who I was, what I could become, and how I could live fully within the life that remained, embracing both sorrow and hope, loss and possibility, with a steady, enduring heart. And now, as I sit in the quiet of my home, I can feel the fullness of all that is past and all that remains, the years of love, of loss, of abandonment, and of endurance, intertwining to form a tapestry that is entirely mine, imperfect yet real, heavy with sorrow yet lightened by moments of quiet understanding. And I realize that I have arrived at a place I never imagined I could reach, a place where grief no longer dominates every thought, where memory no longer binds me to the past, and where the presence of my own being feels sufficient to fill the spaces once occupied by another. The mornings still bring a delicate awareness of absence, but they also carry a new possibility, a chance to greet each day with intention, with the knowledge that I am capable of shaping my experience, of finding small joys, of feeling beauty, and of nurturing a sense of self that has been reclaimed from the shadow of loss. I move through my days with careful attention, noticing the play of light, the subtle sounds that mark the passing of time, the gentle rhythm of my breath, and in these observations, I find a sense of grounding, a reminder that even as life changes and circumstances shift, there is continuity, there is presence, and there is a chance to witness my own growth and resilience. My memories of him, though tender and sometimes painful, no longer carry the sharpness that once defined them. Instead, they exist as quiet companions, pieces of a story that shaped me, lessons that taught me, and reflections that remind me of the depth of my capacity to love, endure, and survive. I have learned to embrace my solitude not as a sentence, but as a space for reflection, for discovery, for the cultivation of a self that is independent, capable, and whole. A self that can hold both sorrow and joy without being consumed by either. I speak to myself with gentleness now, acknowledging the strength that has carried me through decades, honoring the endurance that has allowed me to navigate heartbreak and abandonment, and recognizing the quiet courage that has enabled me to continue, day after day, even when the world seemed indifferent to my suffering. Evenings are no longer feared. They are moments of reflection and calm, times when I can sit in the presence of my own thoughts, acknowledging the journey I have traversed, the losses I have endured, the strength I have discovered, and the quiet hope that, though the future is uncertain, it still holds space for experience, connection, and growth. I understand now that life is not measured solely by what is taken from us, but also by what we continue to carry, what we continue to create, and what we continue to learn about ourselves along the way. And in that understanding, I find a profound sense of peace, a recognition that my story, though marked by sorrow, is also marked by resilience, depth, and the enduring presence of my own heart. As I prepare to rest each night, I carry with me a quiet gratitude, not for what has been lost, but for the strength I have gained, for the awareness I have cultivated, and for the life I continue to live slowly, intentionally, and with the knowledge that even in my later years, I am still capable of discovery, still capable of feeling, still capable of growth, and that the story of my life, though transformed by grief, is far from finished, and will continue to unfold with quiet dignity, resilience, and the gentle awareness of a heart that has endured and continues to endure, finding its way forward in a world that moves ever onward, carrying me with it, one day at a time.